Many people in Europe thought, well, that's the end of Christianity in China. Well, it wasn't, because the following century, in the year 1807, the English missionary Robert Morrison arrived in Canton and began the presence of a number of very prominent Protestant missionaries in China. Morrison was a very interesting guy. He was an Englishman who wanted to travel to Canton. The only way you could get to Canton in those days from England was either by American ship or a British ship. But if it was a British ship, it had to belong to the British East India Company. The British East India Company did not like missionaries. And so they said, Mr. Morrison, you seem to be a nice guy. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, obviously. You seem to be a nice guy, but sorry, we don't want you in China messing up our carefully constructed relationships with Chinese officials. You better ask the Americans to take you to Canton. So that's what Robert Morrison did. He traveled to New York, which was, you know, a fairly lengthy and arduous trip in those days across the Atlantic, and then he persuaded an American trading vessel captain to take him all the way around Cape Horn across the Pacific, and he arrived in Canton in September 1807. And on his way across the Pacific, there's a story that nobody has, I think, convincingly denied, that the captain of the ship, a sort of very gruff American seaman, said, Mr. Morrison, do you think you're going to have any impact on the idolatry of the great Chinese empire? To which Morrison famously replied, no, sir, but I think God will. And Morrison then set about translating the Gospel, the New Testament into Chinese, and then he translated the Old Testament. He only, before he died in 1829, I think he only converted or saw the baptism of, I think, 10 Chinese individuals. And many people would have been completely discouraged by this experience. And added to which, Morrison's arrival in China was coincident with the Western major powers' worst episode of dealings with China. That is the importation of opium into the great Chinese empire. And the Chinese understandably profoundly resented this. They went to war with England. Now, it's important to remember that most of the evangelical Christians in England were completely against the English policy of trading opium with the Chinese and tried very hard to stop it. But nevertheless, they didn't succeed, and you have the interesting story of one of the most gifted of the Western missionaries to China in the Morrison era was called Karl Gutzlaff. Brilliant linguist. He could speak several Chinese dialects so well that Chinese would not believe that he was not Chinese. Although he looked like me, I suppose. They couldn't imagine how he could speak their dialects so well and not be Chinese. Well, Gutzlaff infamously was handing out tracts on one side of a small boat from which opium was being unloaded on the other side, which certainly didn't create a very good impression of Christianity. But the most important person in this Western effort to bring the Christian message to China was a man called Hudson Taylor. And Hudson Taylor founded an organization in 1865 called the China Inland Mission. And if you want to know why China has absorbed and developed and grown in Christianity to such an extraordinary extent, it is largely due to the efforts of Hudson Taylor. The China Inland Mission required volunteers to live like Chinese, to speak Chinese, to eat Chinese, to live with Chinese, and to avoid the enclaves of the foreigners that were associated with Western major powers. It's very interesting. When the Boxer Rebellion broke out in the year 1900, a terrifying attack on foreigners resident in North China particularly, something like 213 missionaries, foreign missionaries, were killed in the Boxer Rebellion, both Roman Catholic and Protestant. But it's an interesting fact that 189 of the 213 or so who were killed were China Inland Mission missionaries. And yet, Hudson Taylor, now in his old age, insisted that the China Inland Mission would not accept any compensation from the Chinese government, which was being forced out of the Chinese government by the Western powers that had taken revenge on the depredations of the Boxers. It's just extraordinary that Hudson Taylor refused to regard himself as a victim and thought that it had been an honor to serve the Chinese people. Now, it's very interesting that the Christian churches in China that have grown up in the Chinese countryside, particularly in Henan, most of them were founded by Chinese who themselves had been trained by CIM missionaries, China Inland Mission missionaries. And if you think about the province in China in which the Christians have become most numerous, which is Henan province, you find that was the province in which the China Inland missionaries were strongest.